Imagine a world where a woman's entire future, her very identity, could vanish with the breath of her husband. What choices were left for her? Especially if she dared to dream of a second chance at love and companionship. In 870 AD, forces conspired to keep her bound to a past that no longer existed, preventing her from stepping into a new life. Number 8. The crushing weight of social stigma and community disapproval. Picture this. The year is 870 AD. The air hangs heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the rhythmic sounds of daily life echoing through narrow alleys and bustling markets. You are a woman, perhaps, in your 20s, recently widowed. Your world, once defined by the comforting routines of a shared life, has been shattered. But the true ordeal often began not with the loss itself, but with the chilling realization of what that loss meant for your standing in the community. Social stigma, a silent and relentless predator, would stalk your every move, casting a long, dark shadow over any thought of remarriage. In many societies of 870, and particularly in the vast stretches of India and the rigidly structured empire of China, a widow was instantly marked. She was no longer simply a woman. She was a woman who had lost her husband, and that loss, through a twisted logic of the time, was often seen as her own misfortune, if not her fault. In India, the concept of pativrata dharma, the unwavering devotion of a wife to her husband, was paramount. A wife's life was intricately woven with her husband's, and his demise for many signified a karmic imbalance, a failure of her devotion, or even an ill omen she carried. To remarry, then, was not just a personal choice. It was a profound transgression against this sacred ideal. It was viewed as an act of disloyalty to the departed soul, a disrespect to the spiritual bond that was believed to transcend even death. Imagine the whispers that would follow you, a low hum of disapproval that seemed to precede your arrival and linger long after you had passed. Neighbors, once friendly, might avert their gaze, their expressions shifting from sympathy to subtle judgment. Elders, the custodians of tradition and custom, would offer grave pronouncements about the sanctity of the first marriage, reinforcing the notion that a woman's purity and virtue were intrinsically tied to her lifelong commitment to one man. A second marriage, for many, tainted this purity, rendering her somehow less worthy, less respectable. She might be seen as impetuous, lacking in character, or worse, driven by unseemly desires. This sidereal judgment wasn't just abstract. It manifested in myriad small, cutting ways. Invitations to community gatherings might cease to arrive. Her presence at religious ceremonies could be subtly discouraged, or she might be relegated to the periphery, her remarried status a visible stain. In China, the Confucian ideals were equally, if not more, rigid in their expectations of widow chastity. The concept of ji, or integrity and chastity, was elevated to an almost divine status for women. A chaste widow, one who dedicated the remainder of her life to mourning her deceased husband and serving his family, was lauded as a paragon of virtue. She embodied loyalty, self-sacrifice, and adherence to the strict hierarchical order of the family and state. Her example was held up for all to emulate, a shining beacon of moral rectitude. Conversely, a widow who chose to remarry was seen as failing this fundamental moral test. She was perceived as lacking in filial piety, not just to her deceased husband, but also to his ancestors, whose lineage she was supposed to honor through her perpetual fidelity. Such a woman would bring shame not only upon herself but upon her original family, and perhaps even more severely, upon her deceased husband's family. Their reputation, their standing in the intricate web of social relations, could be tarnished by her perceived transgression. Consider the powerful impact of public opinion in a world without mass media, where reputation was everything. News traveled by word of mouth, amplified by gossip and moralizing tales. A woman contemplating remarriage would be acutely aware of the social ostracism that awaited her. Her children, if she had any, might also bear the brunt of this stigma, their lineage questioned, their future prospects potentially jeopardized by their mother's unconventional choice. Would they be accepted in marriage? The fear of harming her children's future often outweighed any personal desire for happiness. Pressure wasn't just external, it was internalized, becoming a gnawing doubt within the woman herself. She had been raised in a society that celebrated the faithful widow, that painted a remarried woman as selfish or morally lax. These deeply ingrained beliefs could make her question her own desires, leading to immense psychological distress. The thought of breaking with centuries of tradition, of facing the disapprobation of everyone she knew, was enough to extinguish any flicker of hope for a new beginning. She might choose to live a solitary life, dedicating herself to piety or the care of her children, not necessarily out of personal conviction, but out of the sheer inability to withstand the relentless barrage of societal judgment. The social stigma of 870 it wasn't a law written on parchment. It was an invisible, pervasive force, woven into the very air people breathed, dictating lives with an authority far more potent than any decree. It was the crushing weight of community disapproval, a silent executioner of personal dreams. Number 7. Economic disempowerment and the chains of financial dependence. Imagine standing at the precipice of an abyss, not of your own making, but dug by the relentless currents of societal custom. For a widow in 870, the loss of her husband often meant not just the loss of a companion, but the sudden and brutal severance of her economic lifeline. In many cultures, women, particularly married women, did not independently own significant property or control financial resources. Their economic security was inextricably linked to their husband, or failing that, to his family. This reality created a powerful, almost insurmountable barrier to remarriage. The stark, terrifying prospect of utter economic destitution. In many parts of India during this era, a woman's right to property was severely limited. While she might possess what was known as stridhana, gifts received at the time of her marriage or from her family, this was often insufficient for independent living, especially for a sustained period. The husband's ancestral property, the land, the house, the family wealth, was typically controlled by his male relatives, his brothers, his father, or even his adult sons. Upon his death, his widow did not automatically inherit or gain control of these assets. Instead, she was usually granted a maintenance allowance, a meager stipend for her upkeep, or the right to reside in the family home, but always under the direct supervision and control of her in-laws. This arrangement, while seemingly providing for her basic needs, effectively stripped her of any economic autonomy. She became a dependent, reliant on the good graces and generosity of others for every meal, every garment, every roof over her head. Consider the profound implications of this dependence. If a widow contemplated remarriage, she risked losing even this limited support. Her right to maintenance from her deceased husband's family was often contingent upon her remaining within that family and adhering to their customs, which emphatically included abstaining from remarriage. Should she defy their wishes and seek a new life with another man, the in-laws could and often would cut off her allowance and expel her from their home. Where would she go? Who would provide for her? Without property, without a guaranteed income, and often without marketable skills that could provide for a single woman in that era, she faced a future of abject poverty, or even worse, becoming a burden on her own birth family, who might already be struggling themselves. In China, the situation was similarly grim, though structured differently. While a widow might technically retain her dowry, it was often tied to the family she had married into. Her status as a widow within her deceased husband's family was paramount. She was expected to dedicate herself to raising her children, particularly male heirs, and to honoring her husband's ancestors. Her maintenance was provided by the husband's family, and her primary role shifted to that of a guardian of the family's legacy. If she remarried, she essentially severed all ties with her deceased husband's family. This meant forfeiting any claim to his property, his children, and even her own dowry, which was often considered an asset of her marital household. She would leave with nothing but the clothes on her back, starting anew with no economic foundation. This was a particularly devastating prospect for women who had spent years, even decades, building a life within a family only to face the complete dismantling of their economic security. Imagine the stark reality. A woman, perhaps still young but with no practical means to support herself. She might have children, and their economic well-being would be entirely dependent on her decisions. Could she risk plunging them into destitution for the sake of her own happiness? The economic constraints were not just about personal comfort, they were about survival itself. The very thought of being cast out, penniless and vulnerable, was a powerful deterrent. It forced many women to endure difficult situations within their in-laws' homes, tolerating mistreatment or isolation simply because the alternative was unthinkable. Furthermore, a remarried widow might find it difficult to integrate into a new family's economic structure. Her new husband, if she found one, might not be willing or able to take on a woman with no assets, or worse, with existing children who would need support. In a time when resources were often scarce and familial responsibility deeply ingrained, taking on a financially dependent widow was a significant burden. This economic reality was not merely a consequence of societal disapproval. It was a deliberate and effective mechanism of control designed to ensure that widows remained within the familial structures of their deceased husbands. It created an economic trap, a cage built not of bars, but of relentless financial necessity, making the dream of a new life a luxury few could ever afford. The chains of financial dependence were often invisible, but they held the widow far more securely than any physical restraint. Number 6. The unseen force of religious doctrine and spiritual threats. Beyond the visible specter of social shame and the tangible chains of economic dependence, there existed an even more insidious form of control over widow remarriage in 870, and the pervasive, unquestionable authority of religious doctrine and the chilling threat of spiritual consequences. In societies where faith permeated every aspect of daily life, where cosmic order and divine judgment were believed to govern human existence, the pronouncements of religious texts and priestly authority held immense power. To defy them was not merely to break a social custom, it was to risk one's soul, to invite divine displeasure, and to imperil one's prospects in the afterlife. In the Hindu traditions prevalent across vast swaths of India, the concept of marriage was elevated far beyond a mere social contract. It was a sacred union, a spiritual bond believed to extend beyond this life, spanning multiple rebirths. The marriage vows were not just promises between two individuals, but an oath taken before the deities, binding the couple in an eternal relationship. Ancient Dharma Shastras, authoritative legal and ethical texts that shape society, often emphasize the concept of ekapatnivrata, the ideal of a woman's lifelong devotion to one husband, while specific injunctions against widow remarriage varied and were sometimes open to interpretation, particularly for younger widows or those of lower castes. The dominant priestly and scholarly interpretations increasingly discouraged it. Especially for women of higher castes, the reasoning was often steeped in spiritual fears. A widow who remarried was sometimes considered to be severing a sacred connection, a bond that was believed to persist even after the husband's death. This act could be portrayed as a betrayal of her deceased husband's spirit, potentially hindering his journey in the afterlife, or even bringing spiritual misfortune upon him. She might be accused of disrespecting the divine forces that consecrated her first marriage. The fear was that such an act would lead to a woman being denied a place in heaven alongside her devoted husband, or that her actions might lead to an unfavorable rebirth in her next life. Imagine the constant drumbeat of these spiritual warnings from priests, religious leaders, and even devout family members. The stories of faithful widows achieving spiritual merit through their unwavering devotion were numerous, creating a powerful narrative that framed remarriage as a path to spiritual degradation. In China, the influence of Confucianism, deeply intertwined with ancestor worship and a cosmological view of societal harmony, provided a different but equally powerful spiritual deterrent. Confucian ethics emphasized loyalty, filial piety, and the strict adherence to established social roles. For a woman, her primary role was to serve her husband and his family, to bear and raise children, and to honor the ancestors of her husband's lineage. Her chastity and fidelity, even in widowhood, were seen as crucial for maintaining the cosmic and social order. Chaste widow was not merely a virtuous individual. She was seen as contributing to the moral health and stability of the entire society. She honored her husband's ancestors, ensuring their peace and continued blessing upon the family. Conversely, a widow who remarried was seen as disrupting this harmony. She abandoned her duty to her deceased husband's lineage and, in effect, turned her back on her ancestors. This was not just a social slight. It carried a profound spiritual weight. It could be seen as an act of disloyalty that angered the ancestral spirits, potentially bringing misfortune, illness, or lack of prosperity upon the entire family. The new family she joined would also be wary, fearing that she brought with her the displeasure of her former ancestors. Concept of ghost marriage in some regions, where a deceased person would be symbolically married, further underscored the belief in enduring spiritual bonds that transcended physical life, making the idea of a living widow remarrying appear contradictory to established spiritual norms. These religious doctrines were not just abstract concepts discussed in scholarly texts. They were woven into daily prayers, religious rituals, and the moral education of children. They were reinforced through myths, legends, and cautionary tales passed down through generations. A woman contemplating remarriage would be confronted not just by human judgment, but by the terrifying prospect of divine retribution. The spiritual threats were often presented as a certainty. Her soul would suffer, her afterlife would be bleak, or she would face unimaginable hardships in future incarnations. This deep-seated fear of spiritual consequences often transcended any earthly desire or rational thought, becoming an almost insurmountable barrier. It was the unseen force, the whisper of divine displeasure, that often sealed a widow's fate, binding her to a life of perpetual remembrance and solitary devotion, rather than risking the unknown territory of spiritual damnation. Number 5. The unyielding grip of family pressure and in-laws' control. Imagine living under a microscope, every action scrutinized, every desire questioned, not by strangers, but by the very people with whom you shared your home, your meals, and your lineage. For a widow in 870, the most immediate and often the most relentless form of control over her remarriage came from within the domestic sphere, the unyielding grip of her deceased husband's family, her in-laws. In tightly knit patriarchal societies, the family was the foundational unit of power and identity, and the widow, especially if she had children, was seen as a valuable asset, a living connection to the departed son and a crucial link to the continuation of the family line. In India, the joint family system was prevalent, where multiple generations and their extended relatives lived under one roof, sharing resources and responsibilities. Upon a husband's death, his widow did not typically return to her birth family, especially if she had children. Instead, she was expected to remain within her marital home, under the authority of her father-in-law, mother-in-law, or eldest brother-in-law. Her new role was often defined by her status as a dependent and a caretaker of her husband's children and memory. The in-laws had a vested interest in preventing her remarriage. From an economic perspective, her presence in the household could be useful for domestic labor, child rearing, or even maintaining a semblance of family continuity. Her remarriage would mean a loss of this labor, a potential division of property, however minor, and a disruption to the family structure. But the control went deeper than economics. It was about honor and lineage. For the in-laws, a daughter-in-law who remarried was a profound dishonor. It implied that their son's memory was not sacred enough to command her perpetual devotion, could cast a shadow on their family's reputation, suggesting that they had failed to instill proper values or that their family was not respectable enough to keep her. The mother-in-law, having herself often endured similar pressures and expectations, could be particularly harsh, viewing a remarried widow as a betrayal of her own sacrifices. Pressure could manifest in subtle, yet powerful ways: constant emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, veiled threats, or even outright prohibitions. Imagine a mother-in-law saying, "How can you even think of abandoning your husband's memory? What will people say about our family?" Or, "Who will take care of your children and honor their father if you leave?" These were not just words. They were weapons designed to instill fear and loyalty. In China, the Confucian ideal of filial piety extended to the deceased. A widow's primary duty was to her husband's ancestors, and her continuation within his family was essential for ancestor worship and the continuation of his lineage, especially if she had sons. Her in-laws would see her as the embodiment of their son's legacy. If she remarried, she would be seen as abandoning her sacred duties, breaking the connection to the family's past, and jeopardizing the future of their ancestral rights. Pressure was intense, often formalized through family councils where elders would hold significant sway. The fear of bringing shame upon the family name was a potent deterrent. Families would go to great lengths to ensure a widow remained chaste and within their control, sometimes even building memorial arches or praising her in public to reinforce the idea that her continued chastity was a source of great honor for the family. This honor, however, came at the cost of her personal freedom. The in-laws could restrict a widow's movements, limit her interactions with outsiders, and even control her access to her own children, subtly reinforcing her dependence on them. They might promise her continued security and care if she remained, while subtly threatening to cut her off entirely if she considered remarriage. This emotional blackmail, coupled with the real threat of destitution or social ostracism, created an environment where a widow's choices were severely constrained. Her life became a delicate balance of navigating their expectations, seeking their approval, and suppressing her own desires for companionship or a new family. Even if a widow had children, particularly sons, her in-laws might leverage access to them as a means of control. The thought of being separated from her children, or having their future jeopardized by her actions, was a powerful emotional lever. She was expected to put the family's honor and the children's well-being above her own happiness. Unyielding grip of the family and in-laws was not a distant, abstract concept. It was a daily reality, a constant presence that monitored, judged, and ultimately dictated the course of a widow's life, ensuring that the option of remarriage remained for most an unattainable dream. It was a suffocating embrace that left little room for personal autonomy. Number 4. The heartbreaking cost of losing parental rights and children's custody. Imagine a cruel bargain: your own happiness or the welfare and presence of your beloved children, for a widow in 870. And this was often not a hypothetical dilemma, but a stark, heartbreaking reality. One of the most potent and emotionally devastating controls over widow remarriage was the almost universal custom that upon remarriage, a woman would forfeit her parental rights and lose custody of her children to her deceased husband's family. This was a consequence so devastating that it often extinguished any flicker of hope for a new life, chaining her to a solitary existence. In the patriarchal societies of medieval India, children, particularly sons, were considered the property and lineage of the father's family, not the mother's. Upon a husband's death, the children remained under the guardianship and control of his extended family, the grandfather, uncles, or even elder brothers. The widow's role, if she remained within the family, was primarily as a carebore and guardian of the children, especially until they reached an age of independence. However, her claim to them was contingent upon her continued loyalty to the deceased husband's lineage. If she chose to remarry, she was essentially severing her ties with that family. And when those ties were severed, so too was her right to her children. And consider the agonizing scenario. A young mother, perhaps with infants or toddlers, suddenly widowed. Her children are her solace, her reason for living. But society dictates that if she seeks a new partner, a new life, she must leave her children behind. They would remain in her deceased husband's household, raised by his relatives, often with minimal or no contact with their biological mother. The new husband would not be expected to take on the burden of another man's children, and the original family would certainly not allow their lineage to be raised by an outsider, especially one who would abandon their son's memory. This meant that a woman was forced to choose between the possibility of a new marriage and her role as a mother. For many, the choice was not a choice at all. The bond with her children was paramount, and the thought of leaving them, perhaps never seeing them again, was an unbearable sacrifice. In China, the Confucian emphasis on patrilineal descent was even more pronounced. Children belonged unequivocally to the father's clan and his ancestral line. The widow's primary duty was to raise her sons to continue the family name and ensure the proper performance of ancestor worship. If she remarried, she was essentially abandoning her sacred duty to her deceased husband and his ancestors. Her children, especially sons, were crucial for the continuity of the lineage and would remain with the father's family. A remarried widow would have no legal or customary claim to them. This was a devastating consequence for any mother, but it was particularly brutal in a society where a woman's identity was so strongly linked to her role as a mother and her contribution to the family line. Imagine the emotional torment. A mother watching her children grow up from afar, or worse, knowing they were in the care of relatives who might resent her choice to remarry. The societal narrative would often paint her as selfish, abandoning her children for her own desires, further shaming her and making her decision even harder. This was a powerful tool of control because it tapped into the deepest maternal instincts. It exploited the love a mother had for her children, turning it into a leash that bound her to her deceased husband's family and the life she was expected to lead. Moreover, the children themselves could be used as leverage by the in-laws. They might threaten to disinherit the children, deny them proper education, or simply make their lives difficult if the mother dared to remarry. Pressure was immense, ensuring that the widow would prioritize her children's perceived welfare and stability over her own personal happiness. This often meant enduring a life of loneliness, dedicating herself entirely to her children, knowing that any other path would lead to the irreversible loss of the very people she cherished most. The heartbreaking cost of losing parental rights and children's custody was not merely a legal or customary consequence. It was an emotional weapon wielded by society and family, designed to ensure that the widow remained a perpetual reminder of her deceased husband, rather than forging a new life for herself. It was a choice that no mother should have to make. Yet for countless women in 870 AD, it was the ultimate sacrifice. Number 3. The glorification of chastity and the ideal of sacrifice. Imagine a golden cage, beautifully adorned, yet utterly inescapable. For a widow in 870, and one of the most powerful and insidious forms of control over her remarriage was not a direct prohibition, but the pervasive, societal glorification of chastity, and the relentless idealization of sacrifice. This wasn't about what she couldn't do, but about what she should do, what was held up as the pinnacle of virtue and female excellence. It was a narrative so deeply woven into the cultural understanding of womanhood that defying it was seen not just as a transgression, but as a moral failing of the highest order. In India, the concept of the faithful widow, sati or pativrata, was elevated to an almost divine status. While the act of self-immolation on the husband's funeral pyre, also known as sechi, was practiced in some regions and by some castes, and became more widespread in later centuries, its philosophical underpinnings were already strong by 870 AD. The ideal was a wife whose devotion to her husband was so absolute that her life lost meaning without him. Her continued chastity after his death, her dedication to his memory, and her renunciation of worldly pleasures were held up as the ultimate expression of this devotion. Such a woman was lauded, revered, and believed to accumulate immense spiritual merit for herself and her husband. She became a living saint, a source of blessings, and an example for all women to emulate. This ideal was tirelessly promoted through religious texts, oral traditions, folk tales, and the daily teachings within families. Girls were raised with stories of exemplary widows who lived lives of austere piety, serving their in-laws and children, and achieving spiritual liberation through their steadfastness. The message was clear. A chaste widow was the epitome of virtue, purity, and spiritual strength. A woman who chose to remarry, therefore, was not merely making a different choice. She was falling short of this exalted ideal. She was choosing personal happiness over spiritual merit, worldly desires over sacred duty. Contrast was stark, and the pressure to conform to the glorified image was immense. Who would dare to tarnish their spiritual standing and societal respect by choosing a path deemed so inferior? In China, the Confucian ethic of ji, or integrity and chastity, was similarly idealized, especially for widows. Imperial decrees, local gazettes, and community leaders often celebrated chaste widows who chose to remain single for the rest of their lives, dedicating themselves to their deceased husbands' families and upholding moral rectitude. Memorial arches were erected in their honor, their names were recorded in official histories, and their stories were shared as exemplars of female virtue. These chaste widow arches and similar accolades served as powerful visual and symbolic reminders of the societal ideal. They were public monuments to self-sacrifice, tacitly urging all widows to follow suit. The idealization of chastity was not just about moral purity. It was deeply intertwined with the preservation of family honor and lineage. Chaste widow brought immense prestige to her deceased husband's family and to her own birth family. She was seen as embodying the strength and integrity of their clan. Her remarriage, conversely, brought shame, implying a lack of moral fortitude or a failure to uphold the family's reputation. The societal narrative was so powerful that it created a self-policing mechanism. Women themselves, having internalized these ideals from childhood, often felt immense internal pressure to conform. Thought of being seen as less than virtuous, of failing to live up to the highest standards of womanhood, was a powerful deterrent. This glorification of chastity and sacrifice wasn't a punishment, it was a seduction, a promise of spiritual reward and societal praise. It presented a path of suffering as the path to salvation and honor. It reframed personal longing as a weakness and lifelong devotion as the ultimate strength. The widow was subtly coerced, not by overt threats, but by the overwhelming weight of societal expectations and the powerful allure of being seen as virtuous. Her personal desires were overshadowed by the collective ideal, her individual voice silenced by the chorus of praise for those who renounced the world. This idealization was a golden cage exquisitely crafted, with honor and spiritual promise making the thought of stepping outside its gilded bars almost impossible for countless women. Number 2, the silent force of customary prohibitions and unwritten laws. Imagine living in a society where rules are not always etched in stone or written in formal legal codes, but are woven into the very fabric of daily life, enforced by tradition, expectation, and the collective will of the community. For a widow in 870 AD, the concept of law regarding remarriage was often less about formal statutes and more about the powerful silent force of customary prohibitions and unwritten rules. These customs, passed down through generations, held immense authority, shaping behavior as effectively, if not more so, than any imperial decree or religious edict. To violate them was to invite swift and severe social consequences, often without any need for formal legal action. In many parts of India, while some ancient scriptures offered varying interpretations on widow remarriage, the dominant social custom, especially for upper castes, had solidified into a firm prohibition. This custom was not necessarily a universal written law across all kingdoms or regions, but it was a deeply ingrained practice, upheld by local communities, village councils, and the authority of family elders. If a woman remarried, she wasn't necessarily breaking a king's law that would lead to imprisonment, but she was certainly breaking a societal compact. Consequences were social expulsion, ostracization, and the loss of her standing within her community and caste. Her new children, if any, could be seen as illegitimate and her lineage questioned. This customary law was enforced by collective shunning, the refusal of priests to perform rites for her, and the general disapproval of her peer group. Consider the implications of such an unwritten law. It meant that even if a woman found a man willing to marry her, and even if she was economically able to do so, the sheer weight of customary disapproval would make her life incredibly difficult. Her new family might find themselves shunned, her children unable to find suitable partners or employment. This was not a system of formal courts and judges, but of community opinion acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Power of custom lay in its pervasiveness, and the fact that it was enforced by everyone, everywhere. It dictated social norms, marriage practices, inheritance, and the very structure of family life. For a widow, the custom of perpetual widowhood was a powerful barrier, creating a social environment where remarriage was simply not a viable or desirable option for most. In China, particularly under the strong influence of Confucian thought, customary prohibitions against widow remarriage were incredibly robust. While imperial laws might occasionally praise chaste widows or offer incentives for them, the actual prohibition was often a matter of family custom and local practice, deeply rooted in the principles of filial piety and loyalty. A daughter-in-law was expected to be eternally devoted to her deceased husband and his ancestors. Her remarriage was seen as a profound betrayal of this custom, a stain on the family's honor that could not be easily washed away. The unwritten rules dictated that she remain within the family, observe mourning rites, raise her children for the lineage, and serve her in laws. These unwritten rules were enforced by the family clan itself, which held significant power in Chinese society. A family might disinherit a widow who remarried, refuse her any further contact with her children, or even erase her name from the family genealogy. Community elders would often intervene, subtly or overtly, to ensure compliance with these customs. Pressure was intense, as families were deeply interconnected, and a breach of custom by one member could reflect poorly on the entire clan. Imagine the shame and indignity of being explicitly struck from a family's records, effectively becoming a non-person in the eyes of your lineage. This was a consequence more severe than any fine or short imprisonment. The power of these customary prohibitions lay in their unspoken authority. They were learned from childhood, observed in daily life, and reinforced by societal expectations. They created a profound understanding that certain actions were simply not done, regardless of whether a specific law explicitly forbade them. For a widow, challenging these unwritten laws was akin to challenging the very fabric of her society, inviting a barrage of social and familial consequences that could destroy her life, her children's prospects, and her very identity. It was a silent, pervasive force, more effective than any written decree binding countless women to a life determined by ancient, unyielding traditions. Number 1. The ritual impurity and social exclusion of the remarried widow. Imagine being tainted, marked by an unseen blemish, considered impure, and systematically excluded from the very rituals and social circles that define your community. For a widow in 870, who dared to remarry, this was often the ultimate and most crushing form of control, the imposition of ritual impurity and the resultant social exclusion. This was not just about disapproval. It was about being rendered ritually unacceptable, a pariah in sacred spaces, and often in everyday social interactions. In many parts of India, particularly within Hindu traditions, the concept of ritual purity and pollution was central to social organization and religious practice. A widow, having experienced the inauspicious event of her husband's death, was sometimes viewed as carrying a degree of ill fortune or being in a state of ritual impurity. While her remaining chaste and ascetic could eventually elevate her spiritual status, her remarriage could be seen as an act that exacerbated this impurity, or worse, made her a source of inauspiciousness. She might be forbidden from participating in sacred religious ceremonies, festivals, or family rituals. Her presence at weddings, births, or other auspicious events could be considered bad luck, potentially bringing misfortune upon the celebrants. Imagine being unable to attend your own grandchildren's naming ceremonies or being excluded from the joyful bustle of a cousin's wedding, all because of your choice to remarry. This social ostracization was deeply painful. This exclusion wasn't just symbolic. It had tangible consequences. She might find herself unable to draw water from the village well at certain times, or her offerings at the temple might be rejected. Social invitations would cease, and her children might find themselves similarly tainted by association, making it difficult for them to integrate into social groups or find suitable marriage partners within the community. The remarried widow became a person on the fringes, always observed with suspicion, always carrying the weight of her perceived transgression. Her spiritual impurity was not merely a belief. It was a social marker that dictated her interactions and limited her access to the very communal life that sustained individuals in that era. In China, while the concept of ritual impurity was less formalized than in India, the social exclusion of a remarried widow was equally potent and soul-crushing. Her choice to remarry was seen as a profound abandonment of her deceased husband's lineage, and a violation of the sacred principles of filial piety and female chastity. She was considered to have betrayed her former family, and often her own birth family would disassociate from her to avoid the shame. As a result, she might be ostracized from ancestral rites, clan gatherings, and important family celebrations. Her name might be deliberately omitted from family genealogies, a symbolic erasure that severed her ties to her past and her lineage. Imagine the isolating effect of being ritually and socially cut off. In a society where family and clan ties were paramount, this exclusion meant a loss of identity, a loss of support networks, and a profound sense of alienation. She might be considered an outsider, not just in her new family, but in her original community as well. Her social standing would plummet, and she would find herself without the protective embrace of established social structures. This was not just a matter of personal opinion. It was a societal judgment that relegated her to a lower status, stripping her of the respect and dignity that came with adhering to established norms. The threat of ritual impurity and social exclusion was a particularly effective control because it targeted a woman's deepest needs for belonging, acceptance, and spiritual peace. It forced her to consider the devastating impact of her choices not just on herself but on her children, who would also bear the brunt of this societal judgment. It was a constant, unspoken warning that deviation from the prescribed path of perpetual widowhood would lead to a life on the margins, stripped of community, spiritual solace, and the very essence of social identity. For countless women in 870, this threat of being branded as impure and cast out was the final insurmountable barrier to a life redefined, sealing their fate within the narrow confines of expectation.